When cities and counties get accessory dwelling unit rules wrong, this is the most important tool in my toolbox. This is a guidebook that's been released by the government, and it goes beyond what's written in the code, what's written in the law, to give guidance on how cities and counties should be enforcing ADU rules around restrictions, fees, timing, and all kinds of important things to make your ADU more or less affordable. The only problem is, it doesn't always make the most important parts super obvious. It doesn't spell them out. You have to be a little nerdy like me to read it. For example, there's a whole section about HOAs, like the homeowners association I'm standing in. And if you don't live in a fancy HOA, you might just skip that part, right? But within that section, there's a definition of unreasonable restrictions. And that applies to all ADUs, not just ADUs in homeowners associations. Now, the book doesn't say, hey, here's a list of all the ordinances that should be illegal across the board, but it lays out a path for a homeowner to object on a case-by-case basis to unreasonable restrictions. And that might be very powerful. Now, I'm not a lawyer. This isn't advice for your specific situation. I'm just a guy who's obsessed with ADUs and housing, and I'm sharing my notes after reading this 50-page document with over 100 of the most frequently asked questions that the state gets. So let's head back to the library. We're gonna go back through this book in greater detail, and hopefully I can teach you how I read this book to get to the good stuff, that extra powerful guidance from the HCD that you might not get otherwise. HOAs give me the heebie-jeebies. Let's get out of here. Okay, we're gonna start off with a really great example of why this handbook is so important. You can build multiple ADUs and a JADU on a single family dwelling property. And this has actually been the case since the last handbook, but the last handbook, you kind of had to read between the lines. There was like one line on page 19 that said, hey, you can combine this and this. And a lot of cities and counties missed it. A lot of homeowners missed it. I've been screaming this for years, but unless you watch this channel religiously, you probably didn't realize that you could do the multiple ADU thing. Now, the new handbook makes it much clearer, and I'm going to explain how that's such a powerful tool. So again, you're working on this January 2025 edition of the handbook, and the very first thing in the glossary defines what used to be called a statewide exemption ADU in the handbook. Now they call it a 66323 unit, and that's an ADU or JADU from the government code section 66323. Which were the statewide exemption ADUs. If you're working with one of these 66323 units, a lot of the time you're exempt from some of the city's local rules and restrictions. And there's 4 types of ADUs in this section. One is a single family converted ADU and JADU. That means you're converting existing space in the unit into an ADU or converting existing space into a JADU. And that's an inclusive or, you can do both. Then, Section 2 here is about single-family detached ADUs. And that section as well, as long as you're under 800 square feet and you're within certain other rules like height restrictions, that becomes a special type of ADU that is exempt from a lot of the local ordinances. And then very importantly, they just needed to spell it out as clear as day. If you're doing these kinds of ADUs, the local agency must allow the 4 categories of ADUs listed above to be combined as allowed by the site and lot conditions. This means that on single-family lots, local agencies must allow at least 1 ADU constructed from existing space, 1 junior ADU, and 1 newly constructed detached ADU. So there you go. It's as plain as day. And if you have a city that does not know that this rule exists, which is still very common, you just go in with the handbook and you say, hey, I've got this guidance from the state California Department of Housing and Community Development about how the ADU rules are supposed to be interpreted. According to the official state guidance in this handbook, it says you should allow me to combine these. And a lot of the time, planners are just trying to do their job, and their job is to follow the rules. So if you show them that this is how the rules are supposed to be interpreted according to the state, a lot of the time that's all it takes. Now, if they've been directed to do something else, then you might have to get the HCD involved. And we'll show later in this video how you can use the online portal at the HCD's website to get technical assistance for your city, which is a very kind way to say what I mean. This is a highlight of what this handbook is great at. It issues guidance. It hasn't changed the law. The law has always said you could do this one or this one or this one or this one of the 4 types of ADUs. The guidance just makes it clear that you can combine those, and it spells it out. And so don't just talk about the government code. You can bring in this guidance to the city's planning department and get a lot of good stuff done. Okay. On to the next big surprise. Here on page 39, there is a section on size requirements and restrictions. How is the square footage of an ADU or JADU calculated? Now, the California Building Code has a definition, and it is not the same as what a lot of cities use. So according to this, when a local agency has not adopted specific changes to the California Building Code in its local building standards, then the CBC standards, and in this case, the CBC definition of floor area, shall apply. Now, if the local agency made specific amendments, additions, or deletions relating to the definition of floor area within its local building standards, then those altered definitions shall apply. But if they haven't made those amendments, then the CBC defines floor area gross as the floor area within the inside perimeter of the exterior walls of the building under consideration. So this definition doesn't include the exterior walls. So when you're planning your ADU, you want to figure out if your city's got its own definition of floor area in the municipal code. If it does not, then you have a good case here to say, well, the state guidance says we'll use the CBC definition, which excludes the exterior walls, excludes shafts and pathways, courtyards, stuff like that. That can make a very big difference on a project, and now we have it in writing. So another easy example of how this guidance, it doesn't change the law. It just tells cities and counties, hey, this is how we should be interpreting the law. It's not going to affect every project, but it's going to affect some projects in a very big way. Now we're going to graduate a little. The first 2 examples were easy because multiple ADUs has been in past guidance. They just made it more obvious. And size, it's just a definition thing. So it's not crazy. This is a bit more of a stretch. But couple years ago, when I started talking about multiple ADUs on single-family properties, people told me that was a stretch. And I was like, it's written right here in the guide. It's written right here in the law. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and this isn't legal advice for your specific situation. I'm just reading this guidance and showing you how I read it. But here's the fun part. There's this whole section about homeowners associations, right? It says what HOAs can do, and it says there's some things they cannot do. And here are some examples of effective prohibitions, unreasonable costs, and extinguishments of the ability to construct an ADU or JADU. And this is a non-exhaustive list. It's just, hey, here's some things that would count as things a HOA cannot do. And it starts listing examples, right? And on the next page, it goes on. And the examples get pretty interesting, where they say, well, actually, requiring major structural elements or design changes beyond the requirements set forth in state law that would extinguish the ability to construct or use the ADU or JADU. It says levying excessive application fees, conditions, or other financial requirements that would cause the property owner to incur substantial costs or forego the development. This is interesting because these examples of unreasonable restrictions, they apply to accessory dwelling units outside of homeowners associations too. This is the state government code, and you see the first section just kind of has the findings, and then this section, 66311, I should highlight this, make it easier for you. It says, it's the intent of the legislature that an ADU ordinance and the provisions in that ordinance are not so arbitrary, excessive, or burdensome so as to unreasonably restrict the ability of homeowners to create accessory dwelling units in zones which they're allowed. So this is interesting because now the state is giving us guidance on actual examples of what could be considered unreasonable restrictions. It's buried in the HOA section, but it applies everywhere. There's a similar thing in the historic district section where it says, can an ADU be built in a historic district if the primary residence is subject to historic preservation? As with non-historic resources, an agency may impose objective standards that do not unreasonably restrict the creation of ADUs. So you can see why I think reading this, I'm like, oh, this is pretty exciting. There is now a path that if I were building an ADU and I faced an unpredictable excessive fee or an unpredictable excessive delay, I could make a case with the HCD that this is an unreasonable restriction on my specific case. The ordinance as a whole might be fine, but the way it's being implemented on my ADU is extinguishing my ability to finance and develop this ADU. I think that's interesting. Not legal advice for your specific situation. I am going to use this strategy and test the waters the same way a couple years ago I had people reach out about multiple ADUs. And one by one, we got cities to acknowledge that that's the way the code is supposed to be interpreted. So no promises. This is a work in progress. And again, this is all my opinion, and I'm just reading this for like the first or second time, so please don't take this as actual advice for your specific situation. But in my opinion, there is a lot that we can do with the guidance that we've been provided. Another section that's really cool is going to talk about non-residential conversions. So there's been a lot of debate about if you have a property with like retail on the ground floor and a house above it or an apartment above it, can you convert that retail, which is a commercial use space, into a residential ADU? Some cities allow it because yay, housing, but other cities are sticks in the mud. But this guidance has a specific section about, again, it's buried in the multifamily dwelling section, but it says, it has a list of the types of non-living spaces that you could convert into an ADU, and it includes the leasing office. Now, what does that mean? To a nerd like me, it's saying, hey, the usage of the leasing office is commercial, but you can convert it to residential. And if that's true about a leasing office, what else is it true about? You know, what else can I convert into a residential space? So the same way we think of garages as non-habitable, but we can convert them into ADUs, maybe we can start thinking about stores and retail space across the board as convertible into ADUs, as long as there's a single family dwelling existing on the property. Another exciting section is about pre-approved plans. This one's more for the businesses out there, but a law went into effect last year that said cities would have to develop a way for plans to be pre-approved at each city. If they don't have that process, it's time to get in gear. I know a handful of cities that do have pre-approved plans, and I know cities that do not have a pre-approved plan process. I'm going to go to the larger cities that do not have pre-approved plans yet. I'm just going to write them letters that says, hey, do you have a process to get plans pre-approved? Because I would like to submit a plan for pre-approval. I'm basically going to work with that ADU guy, Derek Sherrill, and he's got plans that he gives away for free. I'm going to work with him. We're going to submit those free plans for pre-approval in some of the larger jurisdictions where they'll fit a lot of yards. We'll probably avoid like San Francisco and cities like that where the lots are very narrow and the house wouldn't really fit. And we'll aim instead for large urbanized suburbs. So they're already developed, it's still residential infill, but there tend to be bigger backyards. Anyway, we're gonna work on that, and I'll keep you in the loop. So like and subscribe if you wanna see more videos about that in the future. And if you're a professional, I think you should do the same. It's just a friendly letter to the city saying, hey, do you have a process for pre-approving plans? Because according to this, you need to have one, and I would like to submit whenever you're ready for me. And you see where it goes from there. There's a lot of definition clarification in this guidebook too. For example, if I can build 2 detached ADUs, because I've got a multifamily property, I'm allowed to build 2 detached ADUs. Do those ADUs have to be detached from each other? Well, according to this guidebook, no. The word detached means that they are detached from the primary structure. They can be attached to each other. And so that's a really good clarifying guidance, right? And there's lots of definitions like that. I'm not gonna read the book to you. Maybe I'll do a separate ASMR channel where I just read HCD guidance to people, but not in this video. I also really like this whole section about the shot clock. You know, when the law has always said cities have a certain amount of days to respond to your permit, and cities have kind of never really respected that shot clock. Now there's a very detailed process by which an application is deemed complete and an application is deemed approved. And there's not as much wiggle room for cities to say like, well, we told you we received the application, so that counts as our response. None of this ridiculous banter. Cities need to approve your permit or reject it with comments, which you can remedy. And there's a process for that. And I'll make a whole separate video about how to approach that in the most strategic way, because like, I guess ultimately you could get a lawyer and go to court, but there is a lighter version that doesn't involve like suing the suburbs that can get you where you're going most of the time. And I'll make a whole video about that on a separate date. Again, like and subscribe to the channel if you want updates like that. All right, now let's look at the actual portal. Honestly, this handbook is awesome because most of the time you walk in, talk to your planning department with the handbook excerpts that are about your project, and that resolves most issues. Now, sometimes though, you're going to have a conflict or you're going to have different interpretations of the language, especially if you try some of the zanier stuff that I've talked about in this video. And for that, you might want to get the HCD involved in your project. You might want to ask them a question, or you might want to get them to offer technical assistance to the city where you are working on an ADU. For that, we're going to open up the HCD ADU handbook. You can find a link in the video description below to download this handbook. Make sure you're working off the January 2025 edition, because that's the new one. And then in the table of contents, it's on page 6. There's a thing for technical assistance, and there's a link to the ADU portal. Any questions regarding the application of state ADU law may be submitted to the HCD via this portal. So we're going to click on that, open it in our browser. The URL should look like calhcd.servicenow.com. And this is an ADU and JADU form specifically. There are separate forms for other departments at the HCD. I love using this form when possible because I like the ADU team. They do a good job. There's a link up here to register. Highly recommend you create an account because it's free. The HCD isn't going to like spam you, and you will be able to upload documents in relationship to your ticket in the future. If you don't create an account, you have slightly more limited choices about what you can do. Then you're going to fill out your private information, and there's a question here. Please indicate your role in relation to your request. That's because sometimes cities are filling this out to request help. Sometimes it's individual homeowners. Sometimes it's like a lawyer or a builder, an architect. So you want to just say who you are and whether you're filing a complaint or asking a question or something else. I'm just going to put question because it's the most simple version of the form. And I have very specific advice that doesn't vary even on the more complicated versions of the form for filing a complaint. When you put in your message, what I recommend is you want to be as specific as possible. So you want to include specific details. You want to have your site address. You want to say if you submitted for a permit, you want to put in a copy of your application and the date you applied for that permit. You want to include any replies you got, acknowledgments from the city or county, and the date you received those replies. You want to say the outcome. You want to say whether you appealed the outcome. You want to include specific contact information for the specific planner who you've been communicating with, not just broadly say, oh, I'm in, Napa, and leave it at that. You want to give them as much as they can so somebody at HCD could just pick up the phone. Very importantly, you also want to tell them, hey, you can use my specific example, my specific project when talking to the city, or please don't use my specific example, depending on your circumstances. But they're going to ask you questions like that, so you might as well just tell them in the intake form and save yourself a round of communication. Once you include all that information, you click You're Not a Robot. You select a topic. There's a lot of topics to choose from. I wouldn't overcook it. It says select all that apply. I tend not to select all of them. I tend to select the ones that I think lead to good outcomes. So like by right ADUs, if you're doing a conversion of existing space under 800 square feet, then I just choose by right ADU and Bob's your uncle. And then you hit submit and you'll get a ticket number, and the HCD should get back to you within about a week. This is a great way to get technical assistance from the HCD. They talk to the city on your behalf. It's also a good way to get answers to your questions. And I will also flag here that the HCD is having a big webinar on February 3rd. You can RSVP for that on their website. I'll put a link in the description below too. This webinar is a great way to ask your questions directly to the HCD if you happen to see this video in January when it's released. If you're watching this in the future, then hopefully we've solved the housing crisis and you don't need this playlist about how all the laws are currently being applied. But maybe it's still a giant cluster, and then in that case, like and subscribe. I'll see you later. Let's build some housing.